Now, looking around the room beforehand as I recognise quite a few faces that are regular attendees at ecobuild. I suspect many of you will have been sat in this same room 5 years ago when the Green Construction Board set out their low-carbon route map for the built environment. Now, that project was setting out what, as an industry, we'd need to do to make an 80% reduction in our carbon emissions by 2050. So 5 years on, how are we doing? Well, you can see from the graph on the right here, we're currently behind on that target trajectory. If we think about built environment emissions, these figures will look slightly different from Adrian's because they'll include a bit of infrastructure, not just buildings. About 3/4 of our emissions in a given year are from operating our existing assets, so that's things like space heating, lighting, and so forth. And then about 1/4 of our emissions are from building new assets. So if you think about the use of materials, fuels on site, and so forth, what we call the embodied carbon there, that green chunk constitutes about 50 megatons or 50 million tons of CO2 every year. Now, if we think about how that's progressed over time, the only time we've really reduced those embodied emissions in the last decade has been during the recession, and that was simply because we stopped building. Every other year, those embodied emissions have increased, and as we move forward, it becomes increasingly more difficult to see how we'll meet our 2025, let alone our 2050 target, or net zero shortly thereafter without addressing those emissions. That means if we want to deliver more buildings, I'm not saying here that we should stop building like the recession to try and reduce our emissions. I fully accept we need more infrastructure, we desperately need more housing. But that means if we want to deliver that extra housing and still meet our carbon targets, then we need to be doing more to reduce emissions in our supply chains. And that means assessing project emissions on a whole life basis, moving away from just operational emissions, and looking for mitigations options in design, materials, and changing delivery models as well. And that means the more that we build, the lower carbon it has to be. So say we want to build 300,000 homes a year. Just to put that in context, building 300,000 homes in just 1 year, the carbon footprint of that would be equivalent to all the plastic bottles we'll consume in the UK over the next 50 years. And yet, whilst this year we've seen a number of new measures to address our plastic consumption, we don't really have any policies addressing our resource use and emissions associated with that in the built environment. That's the kind of scale of challenge that we've got. We don't even really have a very good understanding of how our resource use is distributed across that built environment. We know that to meet the UK's demands for goods and services, it takes about 1 billion tons of raw materials every year, and we know construction's the biggest user of those materials. We've got some rough kind of sector level estimates of how much we use of different types of materials, and some of the trade associations have more detailed information scattered across. But the last time this data was all brought together to give a really comprehensive picture of resource use in our industry was in 1998. Now, in the meantime, we've had 20 years of conferences like this where we'll have presentations about the importance of resource efficiency in the circular economy, and we haven't gone back to revise those 1998 estimates. Now, I'd argue, someone said before they wanted one recommendation for government. I'd argue that that piece of work should be commissioned tomorrow, a fully comprehensive assessment of where resource use and construction goes, and that would inform some of the upcoming pieces like the waste and resources strategy that's coming out later this year. So the sector's a little bit behind on our targets, but as we've heard, there has been a bit of an attitudinal shift in recent years. Have we committed to catch up? Well, here's some of the carbon targets that companies are setting. On the left there, you can see from a review we did last year of a number of large house builders and contractors, the types of targets that they're setting, and on the right, targets from a number of large infrastructure clients. Now, you'll notice a couple of things with this. Firstly, most of them are less ambitious than the national targets that we've set ourselves. They're typically much more short-term in time frame, which is understandable. And also, there's this lovely cliff edge in 2020, which begs the question, does that mean over the next 18 months, most of these companies are going to be revising their carbon targets? If so, now is the perfect time for us to collectively commit to be more ambitious with the targets that we're setting ourselves. And how ambitious, you might ask if you're sitting there thinking, well, I'm probably in one of those companies. Well, this is the kind of trajectory that we need to be on. Now, over the last 2 years, we've seen a number of UK firms sign up to so-called science-based targets, and that's generally aligning themselves with this orange trajectory, the International Energy Agency's 2 degrees scenario there. Now, whether or not you want to be a little bit more or less ambitious, maybe align yourself more with the route map or one of these other trajectories, that's fine. But what we need to all be is somewhere in this rough corridor. So I'd encourage you to imagine your projects on this timeline. This kind of red area here, it's come out a bit pinky there, that's when we need to be hitting net zero emissions as a nation, roughly speaking, some point in that time. So I'd like you to think about the current project you're working on for a moment and where it fits on that timeline. Could you please stick your hand up if you expect the project you're working on at the moment to still be here in 2055? Somebody's still living in it, someone's still working it. Yeah? Quite a lot of people. Okay. Now, how many of you think that that project is ready to operate in a net zero emissions nation? Could you stick your hands up? 2, 3? Okay, that's good. Now, the gap in those graphs and the gap between those two sets of hands, that's the gap we need to close. That's the difference between our ambitions and our actions at the moment. Now, I think we've seen quite a positive change of tone from the government in the last 12 months with the clean growth strategy, the industrial strategy, the 25-year environment plan. But the week after that environment plan was launched with an ambition to phase out avoidable waste, RAP lost 1/6 of its workforce due to funding cuts. Now, ambitions without action won't get us very far. Now, realistically, with Brexit set to dominate our politics and the civil services headspace for the next couple of years, I don't think we can wait on regulation to push this forward. I think we as an industry have to step up, take responsibility, and get on with delivering this low-carbon agenda. So today, I'd like to finish by asking that if you haven't started assessing whole life emissions on your projects, start doing that now. I can point you to all the guidance you'll need to do it. If you're set to renew your company's carbon targets in the next 2 years, be ambitious. Think about that sort of trajectory that you want to be on. And then hopefully in 5 years' time, we'll all be sat here again, and I'll be talking about how we're ahead of our targets and showing you a nice friendly graph. Cheers.
Hello, I'm Bill Dunster, principal of ZEDFactory, and our company's built the zero carbon pod just straight behind at the entrance to this show. I'd like to talk about, we're a veteran of ecobuild, been coming here for as long as I can remember, and we've seen the industry develop. And the message I want to give is that when we built BedZed, working with Bioregional and London's oldest housing association, the Peabody Trust, we planned it in about 1998. And I did the first designs for BedZed in 1991. It was an entry to Prince Charles's Garden City competition. He didn't like it very much, and we spent the best part of a decade in dialogue with his Prince's Foundation to try and see how these ideas could inform the new urbanism agenda. But my point here is that if you take pretty well everything that that any of the previous speakers have said, and you try and integrate it into a project, you get a completely different urban form. You get a completely different architecture. You get a completely different supply chain. The reason why this isn't happening, the reason why Berkeley Homes is not building things that look like this, is because they say it's too expensive, or they say the market's not ready for it, or they say it's not commercially viable. And that causes the problem. The question in the UK is, how do you get an affordable supply chain? How do you reduce the cost so that these integrated products that work together to give you this zero carbon, zero waste, circular economy and construction industry are actually you can afford to use them in development projects. But also they have to work as a whole life costing, and we can't allow the checklist mentality to stop us actually building. So we came up with a very simple methodology which does whole life carbon footprinting and tries to show that actually you can have one number, the number of years it takes till you get, you can pay back the embodied carbon on your new construction project or infrastructure project, taking into account the running carbon, the maintenance carbon, and so on. And because we can now invent buildings which are energy positive, you can displace power from the national grid and use that to create carbon credits that enable you to pay back the original. So this gives you one figure, which is hopefully 44, as in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the meaning of life. We've got projects we're doing now where we've got the carbon payback is around about 25 years. And the sort of projects are looking like this. This is a zero fossil energy home, net annual zero energy bills. And the reason why this works is because the cost of the supply of building a BIPV roof, which generates 8 megawatt hours a year, has come down to the point where it's not much more expensive than conventional roofing. And the cost of storing the electricity means that you don't have to worry about governments and feed-in tariffs any longer. But if your house only uses 4 megawatt hours a year, that leaves you 4 megawatt hours surplus to then put into electric vehicles, transportation, and that starts to reduce urban air pollution. So it's this joined-up thinking, this carbon philosophy, which I don't see happening very much in the UK. It's a checklist mentality, but there isn't a recognition by government that, or indeed anybody really, that particularly developers, that it's the interaction between all the components that gives you all these quick wins. So we've given up. We don't mind anymore about government policies. We can take the city off-grid room by room. We can develop cladding systems now which are not much more expensive than any other rain screen insulated cladding system. We can take existing buildings and make them into zero carbon buildings. We can give them rooftop atrium spaces. We can use e-bike batteries to power rooms. This is a different future. We can use BIPV and solar cooling technologies to remove the need for district heating or CHPs. We can use these same components for the new build program to retrofit existing buildings. So if you can imagine how many buildings in the UK look like this today, and how could they be transformed? This is a live project in Holland. Why is this not commonplace in the UK? Because there is absolutely zero demand. Because there's a whole industry peddling rumours that it's not commercially viable, it's not sensible, and the targets are unrealistic. So the volume house builders lobbied the government to end the Code for Sustainable Homes. We had the highest targets in the world. If we kept to them, we would have the highest standards for our supply chain. We would be net exporters, and the whole situation, or the whole construction industry, would be transformed. Instead, other countries are using these ideas, and they're accelerating, they're getting the global markets, and they're getting our industrial production. And they deserve it, because they have vision, we don't. ecobuild used to be the entire footprint of Excel. It's now only in 3/4 of one hall. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for sticking broadly to time. We've got about 15-20 minutes for questions. I think we've heard quite a whistle-stop tour of what's going well and what's perhaps not going so well. Adrian and Jannik in particular telling us that we've got a long way to go before we actually get on that trajectory for our carbon emission reduction targets. We've heard a lot about some of the solutions already exist. From Bill and also from Louise, but obviously they're still few and far between. So this mass uptake of some of those solutions is definitely not happening yet. And we've also heard about the importance of the natural environment and actually valuing natural capital more strongly. So thank you very much for those contributions. I'm going to go straight out to questions from all of you. And there are some roving mics, I think, in the corridor. So any questions from the audience, and if you wouldn't mind saying your name and where you're from, that would help us a little bit. Here, there's one here at the front. There's a mic just coming to you.
Hello, Sean Curtin. I'm a residential property surveyor, so I'm looking at the challenges we face from just everyday residential property. I think that retrofitting is the biggest challenge we have. If we look here in Planet London, we have so many housing stock from the 1930s with solid brick walls which bleed out a lot of heat. So that's a big challenge. The government itself doesn't seem to be moving forward with that and making these homes more energy efficient. The Green Deal seems to have died a death, and the government itself doesn't seem to be powering forward. Every year I come to ecobuild and I'm inspired by all of the ideas, and I'm also disappointed as well. I can remember when it was at Earl's Court, which is now a big building site, which I hope will be more energy efficient. On my point on retrofit, I hope that one day when I come to here to Excel, that there'll be some trees outside, a green roof, and it will be more energy efficient than it currently looks. My question basically to you is, how do we meet this challenge of retrofit? How do we move forward? We have the philosophy, we hear it, we've got the ideas, we all believe in it, but how do we move it forward? Thank you.
Okay. Question on retrofit there. I mean, it came up in a few of the different presentations. Who would like to have a first pop? Adrian, go for it.
Yeah, we did a report in the end of 2016 looking at the heating sector and what was needed. Part of that is retrofit. It's crucially important to getting those emissions down. In terms of the scale, it's bigger than what we need for new build. We need a policy which is designed to reflect the important times when people make decisions. And that is potentially about when they're taking action to improve their housing for other purposes, or when you're moving house. And we need to target incentives at those times. It's partly why the Green Deal was a failure. It was also too expensive in terms of what was on offer. So how you do it, we're waiting for the government to come forward with plans. We think that what it has said in terms of ambition for 2035 and getting to EPC Band C is broadly in line with our expectations of what is necessary to be on track to the targets going forward, but that we don't have the policies to get there. So that could be policies around low interest loans. It needs to be targeted at the time people are making decisions. If those don't work, those kinds of incentives don't work, then we need to move to a regulatory approach.
Jannik, you wanted to make a point?
Yeah, I think the really key point with this is scale. Just to put it in context, we should be retrofitting one home every minute from now until 2050. That's the scale that we need to be delivering this at. The ambition with the Green Deal was, 14 million homes, which was scale and ambition, but then, 5 homes in the first 6 months, a few tens of thousands by the time it was abandoned. I think what we need to not do is then replace that with a less ambitious policy in terms of scope. We still need to deliver those 14 million measures, and politically it's going to be very difficult to be the person who has to come forward and say, this is what I'm proposing as a replacement for the Green Deal, but that's the only way it's going to get done. So,
I mean, I think there's a crucial point about incentives and carrot and stick here, which we've had a little bit of carrot, but not quite enough, and that's demonstrated that it doesn't work. So, I mean, a number of organisations are calling for mass investment in energy efficiency and retrofit, and for that to be equivalent to a national infrastructure priority, which is effectively the scale that we're talking about. So I think there's quite a significant amount of work to do on the retrofit piece. Any other questions? There was one here at the front here.
Yeah, as Bill was saying, I've been kind of depressed since July 2015. I'm wondering what you're saying we should, Jannik, you're saying we should go beyond the minimum. Unfortunately, I've tried to sneak in a bit of extra insulation into buildings, but the quantities of air always smack me and get me down to building regulation minimum. So what is it in the building regulations you would like to see in the 2019 standard? Because I think we're always designing down to the minimum, but we should be aiming to a higher standard, but actually it's the minimum that we're going to get, probably.
So compliance with minimum standards, what should that minimum standard be, Bill?
Yeah, it's very, very, very simple. The BRE's Code 6, Code for Sustainable Homes, which was going to be mandatory in summer 2016, gave exactly the right balance of environmental performance, deliverable ranges of technologies, and you've only got to encompass those standards and make them mandatory, and you've got a really fit-for-purpose construction industry. And the sad thing was it got dismantled just at the time it was commercially viable, because some people, but not all, some people spent about a decade preparing for it. Now, the reason why it's viable is because other countries are now meeting those standards. So it just means that we have to import all those materials, and it's a failure in terms of job creation and a failure for UK industry to achieve economies of scale. So the country that sets the highest standards wins the export market and gets there fastest.
Any other demands from the 2019 tightening regs?
Yeah,
Louise?
I guess the issues that we...
You need your mic turned on. Can we get Louise's mic turned on?
I guess the issues are, for us, is that a house builder, you know, those regulations have caused other problems, and we have to continually deal with those other problems, such as overheating in our buildings. So we do need to think holistically about how we do design and how we manage the energy and the heating demand in our buildings. And the policy, you know, everyone was going for CHP, and now everyone's saying CHP is not the right answer, and now we're looking at heat pumps. And so for us, there's a lot of uncertainty of what the right technology is. We've just got used to putting in CHP systems. We know how to put them in, we know how efficient to make them, and now everyone's saying they're not the right technology. So it is quite difficult with everything changing. So I think we need to go back to basics and think more about going towards passive house standards, and then hopefully we'll be able to deliver, but whilst looking at other areas as well.
So why did you lobby against the code?
Adrian, you wanted to come in there, and then I'll go out for...
Yeah.
The
committee, we're doing another piece of work at the moment to look at standards and where they might be set going forward, and we'll hopefully going to feed that into our June progress report to government. But the other point I want to make is it isn't just about the standards and improving those, which I think there is plenty of scope to do. It's also about the performance gap. I don't think we're building now to the standards that we're meant to be building to. There's a big performance gap, and that needs to be tackled as well.
Yeah, very good point, well made. Let me just go out to just take one more question, because we've only got 10 more minutes, and then maybe you can answer it with...
Thank you, Chairman. Michael Stock from Imperial College. Some years ago, I did some work for the National Audit Office, which confirmed exactly what Bill Dunster has said about the abolition of the code. The evidence was quite clear that the government had been lobbied and that the impact assessments were not sufficient. My question, though, is not about despair, which comes so easily, or about optimism, which is irrational, but about hope. Is there any hope at all that the enormous gap which has been created by the lack of leadership within the government can be filled by the new metropolitan mayors at a more local or regional level in the UK?
Great question. Would anyone here? Yannick, you were bursting itching to come in.
If I can briefly respond to the previous question, then I'll come on to that. I think the key thing with the previous questions is about value and how we interpret that and distribute that. There is a value in that extra insulation going in to the person who is going to live in that home. And at the moment, that isn't captured in that process. And it's not in a way that then someone can justify that decision. So we talk about value engineering out these options. Well, value to who and over what part of the project's lifespan? You know, once that's in operation, that will be generating value. In response to the second part, I think the reason that we can be hopeful about this is that we do have people building stuff that meets these standards. It's not that it's not possible. We have plenty of physical examples we can point to and say this can be done. So for that reason, that's why I'm, not crying into my cup of tea at night as someone who works on climate change every day. We have the solutions there. It's just a question of choosing to use them and coming up with the frameworks and the systems that support their use and the policies that will deliver that. I think we can do.
Any other responses on the city leadership metro mayor point?
I think
Louise.
The London plan is a great example of it. I mean, the London plan has set some really stringent targets on a number of things, including energy. They're looking at changing the heat hierarchy as well. You know, they're also thinking about air pollution. So they are really pushing it, and that shows what you can do at a more city level. And you know, Manchester, Birmingham, they're all setting their own standards. So yeah, hopefully we need to rely on it at that scale if it's not there at the national scale.
Okay, so now we have just over 5 minutes left, and I'm going to ask each of you to give us your one key ask, your one recommendation of action. So if you can frame it as a bit of a call to action with a target stakeholder group, whether it's government or city leaders or whoever, that would really make this gap diminish and move the needle to really accelerate progress going forwards. Louise, shall I start with you?
Okay, so my ask is that we focus on climate change adaptation. We look at the whole of sustainability. Whilst carbon is really important and it has been a focus for us, we do need to think about adaptation at the same time.
Okay, holistic view. Jannik?
I'll go with, on the point about local authorities, I'd like to see whole life carbon assessment requirements get brought in the coming years by the GLA and others. Not targets initially. I'm not being overly ambitious here. I just want people to start assessing. When they start assessing, they will start reducing, and it provides you with the information that means we can start setting benchmarks in the future.
Whole life carbon assessments from Jannik. Stephanie?
I think this session in microcosm demonstrates my point that we're not taking issues around the natural environment seriously enough. All the questions, all the responses that came back were about carbon again. This is kind of where we were with carbon 20 years ago. We're on a glide path. If the engines fail on your aeroplane, and I sincerely hope they don't, you may not know anything about it for the first 10 minutes or so. You won't just fall out of the sky, you'll carry on gliding. And the pilot's probably got 20 minutes or so to find a safe place to land. I would say that in terms of the natural environment, we are currently on the glide path. Now is the time that we have to act, and we really need to raise the profile. Thank you.
Okay, great, thank you. Bill?
I'd like to see all subsidies to fossil fuel generation and nuclear ended, and the true cost of generating electricity allowed to rise and rise and rise, and that will create an engine which will stimulate all of the retrofit solutions that have been discussed today.
Very good. Very specific, thank you. Adrian?
Right, there is so much. So I would say, look at our Clean Growth Strategy Assessment report from the middle of January. If I have to pick one thing in this area, I'm going to say I want to see an ambitious plan from the government soon about how it's going to deliver Band C for the housing stock, for the building stock, by 2035.
Very good. So there you have it. Let's have a quick show of hands, I think, just as the final exercise. So Adrian, very strong, ambitious government plan. I think Bill, very clear, addressing subsidies and pricing mechanisms from government. Stephanie and Louise both making a plea for the natural environment to feature much more strongly in the sustainability approach being employed by business and government. And Jannik, a plea for local government primarily to use whole life carbon assessments or to require them. So let's have a show of hands for Adrian and Bill, and who thinks that government has the greatest responsibility in this space to make us really move forwards. Quite a significant number on your side. Who thinks local government has a very significant responsibility? Interesting, much fewer hands going up on local government. And the industry and the developers and business at large? Even less. So I think we have a very, very strong government, we need leadership from government audience here. I don't think any of us would argue with that. I would personally say I think we need leadership from absolutely all of those target stakeholder groups. Central government, local government and planning authorities, absolutely we need that city leadership. We need businesses within the built environment industry, but also businesses that are not in the built environment industry, that are occupying space, and individuals, residents, customers, like every single person in this room, to show leadership by showing what the demand for more sustainable buildings is. So I don't think there's any one solution, but I think leadership required for more. So hope you've enjoyed this session. Thank you very much for coming this morning and listening. Thank you very much to our panelists, and enjoy the rest of ecobuild.